Welcome everybody to my presentation today on accessing sources of food safety validation. So the purpose, let me get my slides going here. The purpose of the session that I want to go through today is really getting you to understand the difference between the different types of validation and what type of processes need to be validated. And then also going through and providing some examples of common validation sources for food safety, critical limits, and also control measures. So I always like to do learning outcomes for any training that I do deliver. So this particular webinar today is going to focus on explaining the differences between validation of control measures and also verification, since they're two of the most confused words in the food industry, I believe. Then we're going to go through and have a look at some legal and GFSI requirements for completing validation. And then finally, we'll specify some common critical limits and control measure validation examples and their sources as well. So for those of you who have not met me before or heard of HACCP Mentor, I've been around for a few years now, just going on just over 30 years, working in food safety compliance. I started my life as a food inspector working for the government here in Australia. You can tell by my accent, I'm from Australia. I've had the HACCP Mentor website platform going on about 12, 13 years now, probably close to 14 years. And that's where I just tend to explain how to comply with a lot of the food safety standards, especially the GFSI standards, and to help you out there. I also work as a BRCGS consultant and also as a BRCGS approved training provider. Along with, I do write a lot of their training content. So if you've been through any of the BRCGS training, it may have been ones that had been written by myself. And I do a lot of the online training development, which is an area that I do like. Now, we'll just get straight into it, having a look at, firstly, since our talk today is about validation, I thought we'd start with what is validation. So there's actually a couple of different definitions of validation, depending on where you're located and depending on what rules you need to follow. So when I talk about rules that you have to follow, this could be your regulatory requirements, it could be your third-party certification requirements, other customer requirements. You know, there's lots of different ones. So I'm just going to point out three general definitions of what is validation. So the first definition comes from, let's say it's Codex HACCP, and it's directly from the Codex General Principles of Food Hygiene, the 2023 edition. So for those of you who don't know, this has just been recently released, this actual edition. So you can download it directly from the Codex website, or you can have a look on my website. I do have a link to it there as well. So their definition, or Codex, defines validation of control measures as obtaining evidence that a control measure or combination of control measures, if properly implemented, is capable of controlling the hazard to a specified outcome. So this definition actually changed from the previous definition. If we go back to 2003, it did get updated in the 2020 edition of the Codex General Principles for Food Hygiene. So previously it just talked about obtaining evidence that the elements of the HACCP plan are effective. So we can see now in this updated definition, like I said, going back to 2020, rolled into the new 2023 version or edition, that we're now starting to talk more about validation of control measures. Now, our next definition comes from FSMA. So for those who are based in the US, this should be quite familiar. It's coming from the Current Good Manufacturing Practice Hazard Analysis and Risk-Based Preventive Controls for Human Food, or basically the Human Food Rule. So the definition's from part 117. So this part defines validation as obtaining and evaluating scientific and technical evidence that a control measure, combination of control measures, or the food safety plan as a whole, when properly implemented, is capable of effectively controlling the identified hazards. So again, similar, a bit more wordy than what the Codex definition is, but this definition now also talks about the food safety plan as a whole, where before we're just talking about control measures or combination of control measures. And then our final definition of validation that I wanted to talk about today is the BRCGS definition, which is in the Global Standard Food Safety Issue 9. So this is taken directly from that standard, where they say validation is defined as obtaining evidence through the provision of objective evidence that a control or measure, if properly implemented, is capable of delivering a specified outcome. So that definition is probably a lot more aligned with the Codex definition. So out of all of these takes on what validation is, there's a couple of points we can take from it. It relates to control measures or controls. It's all about controlling hazards. That's the second part. And then the third part is we want to make sure that the control measure that we're going to implement for a hazard is going to be effective. And it's how we, that's basically what validation is. So I also just want to touch on verification. As I said before, it's validation and verification is two of the most confused words, I believe, in the food industry. So before we get into the depths of validating control measures, let's just have a look at this definition. Okay, so verification is very different to validation. And I do train HACCP principles, or the HACCP Alliance HACCP course, and one of the assignments that students are to do is around validation. And you'd be surprised how many times people still submit stuff based on verification. Just got to remember they're two very different things. So verification, and this definition is coming from Codex General Principles of Food Hygiene as well. So verification is the application of methods, procedures, tests, or other evaluations in addition to monitoring to determine whether a control measure is or has been operating as intended. So to put that in a visual picture, this is the easiest way that I find to distinguish between validation and verification. So validation is what you do before you make the product or before you implement a process, where verification is what you do after you've made the product or after you've implemented a procedure. So what we're wanting to do is confirm that our control measure has been successful in controlling the hazard. You may have heard it spoken about in the realm of validation being, if we're going to talk about 4 control measures, validation, will the control measure control the hazard? Where verification is, did the control measure control the hazard? Okay, I hope that's clear for everybody. Okay, so I want to have a look now at the different places that require you to validate. So we'll start off with Codex HACCP, or the General Principles for Food Hygiene. So critical limits for control measures at each CCP need to be specified and scientifically validated to obtain evidence that they're capable of controlling hazards to an acceptable level if properly implemented. So I've got two sections in Codex, and these relate back to the principles of HACCP. So Principle 3 will talk about having to have validated critical limits, and Principle 6 will talk about having to validate the HACCP plan as well. So before the HACCP plan can be implemented, its validation is needed. So this basically consists of making sure that a few different elements are capable of ensuring the control of significant hazards that you've identified and that they're relevant to your food business. So these are things like identifying the hazards, your critical control points, critical limits, control measures, the frequency and type of monitoring of CCPs, corrective actions, frequency and type of verification, and the type of information recorded. So we want to make sure that all of that makes up our food safety plan is going to be effective. Okay, so again, this is the latest version of the General Principles of Food Hygiene. Said you can either jump on the Codex website and download it. You can have a look on the HACCP Mentor website, it's there as well. Or you can also Google it, you'll find it. Just make sure you put 2023 in. Okay, legal requirements. So this is our secondary source of the requirement to validate. So as a general rule, wherever there's a legal requirement to implement a Codex-based HACCP or food safety plan, you will need to validate your control measures. Okay. So some of the key references: Human Food Rule, I said, from FSMA, Produce Safety Rule, again, FSMA, Juice HACCP, any of the regulations out of Europe, UK, where you've got the requirement to have HACCP-based food safety plans or programs, different industries, that's going to be all written up in your regulations or legislation, if you like to call it. Our third source of where validation ends up being a requirement is all of the GFSI recognised food safety programs that have been based on HACCP will include a requirement to validate your control measures. Okay, so GFSI dictate this through their guidance documents, and then each of the standards have to include it within their own standards. So I think maybe we'll ask later on, Simon, when we get to the questions, just to get an idea of how many people have got third-party certification and the requirement to implement HACCP as well. Okay, so digging into validation now. We understand what validation is, and we want to go further to see what types of validation there are. So there's basically two types. There's either theoretical validation or process validation. Now, your use of either is going to be dependent on what type of product you're producing and what you're trying to achieve. And we will look into this when we have a look at our examples in a minute. So for our theoretical validation basically uses data from another source that is scientifically sound. That's the key thing there. It's got to be based on science. So this can include things like legislation or regulations, depending on what you call them in your country of origin. Different types of codes of practice, industry standards. So again, depending on what industry you're in, you may have an industry association that puts together standards. We've got other international standards as well, journal articles, research papers, supplier specifications. So basically it's anything that's from another source, but it has been based on science. So theoretical validation, I think, is the easiest type of validation to do. It's just a matter of doing your research and understanding what your food safety outcome is against the hazard that you are trying to control. Our next type is the process control validation. So process control validation is where your food business does the actual product testing to establish that the critical limits that you have chosen are going to work. So when you do process validation, you need to make sure that you've got a sufficient amount of data to support your findings. So it's not enough just to be able to, or not acceptable, I should say, to just test one product and use the data that comes out of that. Say you do one test of one product to see if it's got salmonella in it. You really need to do your testing under several conditions over multiple time frames. And this might involve doing it at different times of the year. It might be different shifts or operational shifts, using different equipment, different thicknesses of food, like foods, but from different suppliers. So you've really got to do, quite in-depth testing to be able to come up, or to get all your data together to come up with what your findings are going to be. Where HACCP guidance has been developed by external experts, so instead of the HACCP team, you may not have the capacity within your own business or your team to do process validation. So you can do it by external experts, but you just need to make sure that the limits that fully apply to a particular operation or product or group of products under consideration has been clearly communicated. So it's about knowing exactly what you're trying to achieve out of all the testing that you're doing. Our next one is the collection of data during operational or operating conditions in the whole food operation. So that's similar to what I was just saying. So looking at biological, chemical, or physical data relating to whatever hazard it is that you are reviewing, generally collected for a specified period of time. Might be 3 weeks, might be 10 weeks, 12 weeks, and this is being done on full-scale production. During operating conditions, that's going to be representative of the whole food operation. Okay, you need to also consider if you have like a major rush on your production, because that can actually put different burdens on, the hazard you're trying to control. Our next one there is mathematical modelling. So this basically means integrating scientific data on how factors affect the performance of whatever the control measure is, or the combination of whatever control measures that you've chosen, and how they affect their ability to achieve the food safety outcome that you want. There are some mathematical models, such as pathogen growth models, around that assess the impact and changes of pH and water activity on the control of pathogen growth. So they're out there and available now. So you can look at those as well. And we've got another one that you can also do is surveys. So this might be around, say you're going to evaluate customers' understanding of information on the label prior to doing any design of your label, because you want to make sure that, if it, say the label related to allergen ingredients, you'd want to make sure that the consumer knew what that meant, and that they could read the information and it was clear to them. So you could use surveys as well as part of process control validation. Okay, so we've got theoretical and then we've got process. So you can see where process could take a lot longer, a lot more effort, a lot more resources, a lot more money. So I always recommend, if you can get away with it, stick with the theoretical validation. Okay. So we're going to have a look at some different examples now of control measures that need to be validated. So traditionally, you may have just been used to validating your critical limits of your CCPs. So now that you'll find that you actually have to validate your control measures. And they have to, and also, sorry, the control measures, not just for your CCPs, but also your control measures that have been incorporated into your prerequisite programs or your support programs, whatever you want to call them. So let's have a look at a couple of these different examples. Now you'll see the way that I've written these up. I've talked about the hazard is in the first column, and then what the control measure is, and then the validation outcome. So the validation outcome is really answering or finishing the sentence, we need to validate that, blah, blah, blah. So we look at the first one there, it's pathogen survival. This is the hazard, okay? Pathogen survival during the heating process. So whenever you write your hazards, try and make sure that you include the cause of the hazard, because that's going to dictate really what your control measure is. So for example, if you said glass contamination from shattered overhead lights, the way you control that particular glass hazard will be very different to the way that you control, say, glass from if you were packaging into glass jars or something like that. So you need to be very clear with that hazard identification and the cause of the hazard or the source of the hazard. The control measure we've said here is, and you can use whatever word for whatever process you're doing here, blanch, cook, pasteurize, hot hold product above a particular temperature for X amount of time. That's going to be your control measure. And then our validation outcome. So this is what we need to go and validate. So we're asking that question. We need to validate that the temperature and the time are sufficient to control or destroy the target pathogen. So again, you need to be very clear on what pathogen are you trying to control. Is it Salmonella? Is it E. coli? Is it Listeria? Is it Clostridium? Is it Bacillus? You just need to be very clear on that. Okay, let's look at the next one, which is the presence of undeclared allergens due to insufficient cleaning. So we've said that our control measure for this particular hazard is going to be to remove all target allergenic material from a surface. So when we talk about target allergenic material, it could be peanut, tree nuts, crustaceans, soy, whatever. So again, be direct in what you're trying to achieve here. Now we're saying we need to validate that the method used to remove the target allergenic material is suitable. So this is the actual process that you're going to use to go through and remove that allergenic material. Our next one here is quite a common one that I see when I audit, and that is the presence of metal in finished product. So that's the hazard. And here it's stated that the way that we're going to control metal in finished product is to pass all of the finished product through an operational metal detector that detects and also rejects product contaminated with metal. So again, ask the question. We need to validate that The metal detector has the ability to detect and reject metal in finished product. So that's what we're trying to get out of that's the outcome of our validation. Let's have a look at some other ones. Hazard being transfer of E. coli to food by a food handler who has not washed their hands after going to the toilet. Control measure, thoroughly wash and dry hands according to your SOP, standard operating procedure, after going to the toilet. Then we're asking the question, we need to validate that the hand washing process is effective in removing E. coli from the hands. So what you will find, this will relate back to, you can validate this by a theoretical validation with regulations, which will say things like, again, depending on where you're located, hand wash water must be a certain temperature, you have to have soap, you have to have clean running water, you have to have disposable paper towel or some mechanism in order to be able to dry hands. You have to have hand wash signage. So all of these things help promote effective hand washing. So if you were to do something different, you have your own standard operating procedure that you want your staff to go through, you can go through and validate that. And it could be through a process validation where you're then taking swabs of hands after people have followed the procedure. Maybe it's using a particular hand sanitizer after your hands have been washed. You may want to validate that that particular hand sanitizer is going to work or do what it's meant to do. Our next one here is pathogen survival post-cleaning. Our control measure here is applying a certain sanitizer at a particular concentration after the surface has been thoroughly cleaned. So again, we go back and make that statement. We need to validate that the sanitizer used is at whatever stipulated concentration you've got, is effective in controlling or killing pathogens. That one's fairly straightforward. Again, theoretical validation is going to come in for this particular one. And the most common source would be going back to the actual manufacturer of the sanitizer and asking for their validation of the product that they've sold to you. And they will generally have the procedures, and this is the same with your cleaning chemicals. Your manufacturer or your supplier of those chemicals should be giving you that information to say, if you use our product this particular way, at this particular concentration, it is going to be effective in removing X pathogen. So then the emphasis goes on making sure that the validation that they've provided you is, or that based on a particular procedure, is the same procedure that you're implementing within your business. Our final one here, we've got the growth of spoilage organisms due to incorrect storage temperatures. Our control measure here is to store product in chilled or frozen storage below 5 degrees, 41 Celsius or 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, we need to validate that the allocated storage temperature can control the growth of spoilage organisms or target pathogens. This one, again, theoretical validation will come in handy here. You can refer back to your local regulations. You'll find that from what I've seen, they'll all have prescriptive requirements around storage temperatures, especially of ready-to-eat foods or high risk, I should say, ready-to-eat foods. Some other ones you may have heard of, using CIP systems to clean processing equipment. That is another one you'd need to validate. Again, you'd go back to the manufacturer of that CIP system, the chemical supplier of the chemicals being used in that system to provide that validation. If you were doing something like if you're handling allergens in your business, and this is something that happens a lot with powdered product, if you're using a type of push-through method, so this is when you basically push through finished product at a particular quantity of the finished product for the next cycle. So maybe you've had one product go through that had an allergen in it, and now you're going to push through a non-allergenic product to get rid of the allergenic product. So it could, you might put like a salt through as well. It could be something or any other material. But it's all about, it's a method to remove allergens from your equipment, especially if it's a closed system. So you would need to go through and validate how much or what quantity of finished product would need to be pushed through to achieve like a complete zero of the allergen that you're trying to control. Shelf life of your product is another classic validation. And again, if you've got a third-party certification standard, you've got to validate your shelf life. And that doesn't mean you go to the supermarket and see what your competitors, what shelf life they're putting on their product. You actually have to get that information yourself. And this is one that will definitely tend to be process-based. And you can work with your local laboratory, again, working out what your target pathogens are or spoilage. Spoilage bacteria that you're trying to avoid in that process. Label claims is another one. So if you're making, say, organic claims or fat-free, low carb, high protein, low salt, all of that needs to be validated up front, okay, before you actually start producing the product. So we want to know, is this product we're producing going to be, less than 5 grams of fat per serving size? So again, you can go back to your labeling legislation as a theoretical validation, and it will tell you what levels of these type of claims are allowable to be able to make that claim. So that's going to be your validation source. Precautionary allergen labeling, or PAL. See, this is coming through in a few different countries now. I believe Codex released their final guidance, or maybe draft guidance this week on that. I haven't looked into it completely. But precautionary allergen labeling are things like putting a may contain statement on a product. I know within Australia, we've got new precautionary allergen labeling coming through for the industry. Food industry starts next year, or comes into force next year. This basically is, you just can't put blanket statements on products. You have to be able to validate that if it's not the allergen's not an ingredient in your product, well, where has it come from? And having may contain statements is not a get out of jail card for you not being able to clean your equipment properly. What's some other examples? Survival of pathogens in water, like post-chlorination. So if you're having to chlorinate water for whatever reason, if you don't have potable water, again, using theoretical validation, you'll have your country legislation that will say what makes water potable and what's not potable. And then you can also have antimicrobials used in wash water if you're doing leafy greens. That would be another one that you could go down the track of doing process validation for that one, because there's a lot of variations that can occur with wash water for leafy greens, turbidity, pH, the type of product, how dirty it was, how effective, the chlorine you're dosing. So that would be a good example of one that you would do process validation on. So there are a few examples that you can consider. So let's have a look at now actually going through and documenting your validation. So again, if you're required to comply with Codex HACCP, or it's written in a law or customer standard, Codex does require that the validation of control measures to be documented as per Principle 7, established documentation and record keeping. So let's have a look at what that could look like. This is just a sample, okay? I like to do these up for my clients. It's basically just a summary table that you can use to document your validation of your food safety control measures. This is a cut down version of the examples provided in the Codex guidelines for validation of food safety control measures. I don't fully go in depth with it, just because a lot of times we will use, for my clients, I use the theoretical validation. So you can see at the top here, we've got the hazard that we're trying to, we're targeting, what our food safety outcome is. And that was that third column we saw before. The control measure that we want to validate, what approach we're going to use. So whether we're going to use theoretical, if it's coming from legislation, if it's scientific data, you can write whatever those ones we looked at before. The parameters and decision criteria. So this is basically saying, in our example, the temperature and time will be considered validated if the product meets established microbial criteria or microbiological criteria. So having that decision criteria makes it very clear then what you are trying to achieve as well. The validation information, so this is like your reference source. I've just put a fictitious one in there, Food Standard Code 120B. So don't go looking for that. Okay, it's just, I've just made it up for the purpose of this training. So you're going to put your actual source in there, especially if you use legislation. The other thing I would do as well is, if you've got like a multiple papers, because obviously when you get audited to GFSI or to these, BRCGS or one of those other standards, you need to have a copy of your validation reference source on file. So you might want to write in there just where that's stored or what you've called that document, if you have it collated, if it's all collated for the purpose of how you manage your documentation in your food safety management system. The data validation, so we know when it was done and who was it prepared by. So that's fairly straightforward in going through and documenting how you're going to present that information. Okay, now to wind this up, here are some technical references. Like, there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of references that you can use for your definitely theoretical validation. So I've only just thrown a couple okay, on the slide. But definitely the first point of call, definitely look at that guideline for validation of food safety control measures put out by Codex. Again, depending on your industry, FDA have a lot of great industry guidances that you can follow. Now, you don't have to be located. This is the other thing. You don't have to be in the US to use those as reference sources. Okay? You can be anywhere, long as it's going to be relevant for the type of product you're using or you're producing and the hazard you're trying to control, and it marries around to the the equipment that they've used or the process that they've used. It's the same as what you're doing. The FDA Bad Bug Book, that gives you good background on different pathogens and what their kill rates are and things like that. If you've done the FSMA PCQI course, there's that workbook. There's a lot of great examples in there as well. If you have a look in the new Codex, I shouldn't say the new, the updated edition 2023 of the general principles, there's a table in the back of that which is new, which compares control measures with, and it gives you examples as well. So take a look at that. World Health Organization, like these are all websites you should be looking at quite regularly. Excellent information there. The Codex website in itself, there is so much information on there, and guidelines and code of practices and things that you can be drawing from to be able to help you do theoretical validation. The Food and Agricultural Organization, again, it's World Health and FAO. They're the ones who make up Codex. And then, of course, any of your government websites. So not just your federal government, but also look at your local councils or your local state authorities. They can also be quite helpful with information. And definitely if you're part of an industry association, they will have lots and lots of information. Again, all theoretical, that you can go back and reference and use that as your validation. Okay, so that's just, like I said, there's thousands of reference points, but that just gives you a bit of an idea. I always say Google is your friend, so get in there and literally Google, how would I validate storage of camembert cheese or brie cheese, things like that. And you might have to go past the first page on Google. Just make sure that whatever, if you're going to go the theoretical route, make sure that you use relevant science-based information. You also need to make sure that it's current. You might find papers from the 70s or the 60s, which some of them are still relevant, but there's also been a change in pathogens becoming a lot more resistant to certain processing. So you need to make sure you consider that as well. So just as a recap, we've gone through and explained the differences between validation and verification. We've had a look at the legal and the legal requirements, and also the GFSI requirements for completing validation. We looked at what BRCGS have got there. And then we've had a look at some common critical limits and control measures and their validation examples. And we've had a look at some sources as well. So if you haven't been to the HACCP Mentor website, make sure you go check it out. There's lots of great information on there. I've been writing there for many, many, many years. I would probably like to get a reference page up of just different links to different validation sources, but maybe that will happen in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.